Tonight on Crime Stories, Chicago, 1966. 8 young nurses viciously murdered. One survives. The only witness to the crime.
After that night, people were, and continue to be through all these years, afraid of that stranger who may come into their home in the middle of the night and slit their throat.
This is Crime Stories. I'm Richard Belzer. On July 14th, 1966, the citizens of Chicago awoke to some shocking news. 8 young women had been slaughtered in the apartment they all shared as student nurses. Public reaction, needless to say, was hysterical. The scale and barbarity of the crime were unusual. But more incredible yet, one person survived to tell the story.
Today, like most days, the streets of Jeffrey Manor seem calm and peaceful. But early in the morning of July 14th, 1966, a vicious crime shatters that peace forever, as residents of this quiet, middle-class Chicago neighborhood awake to the terrified screams of a young woman.
It was just like seeing a little girl who lost her mommy or something. She was just, ah!
Joe Cummings is the first reporter at the crime scene, a nondescript townhouse at 2319 East 100th Street.
I pull up and here's this policeman. He's like going in circles on the lawn. He's got his hat on backwards, his blouse is open, he's quite disheveled. He's like really shook up, you know? I says, what's wrong, what's wrong?
Something is terribly wrong.
I jump out, I grab my tape recorder, I run in the living room of this townhouse, and there's a body there. So I turn around, I come back out, I said, you got a homicide.
The body in the living room is that of Gloria Davy. The young student nurse has been strangled with a bed sheet.
So I run up the stairs, I'm like, what the hell is this? And then I go by the bathroom, there's a bathroom right over here, and there's a couple more, one more body there. There was one body there, one downstairs, 3 in this, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, okay. And there was one more, yeah. So I'm moving around, I'm hearing like squish, 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 what the hell's that noise? I look down, and on the soles of my shoes is blood. I mean, blood. And I'm saying, what the hell is, this is a massacre.
Like Gloria Davy, the other 7 victims were all nurses at a nearby community hospital. 23-year-old Nina Schmale wanted to be a psychiatric nurse and was engaged to her boyfriend of 7 years. Marianne Jordan was an athletic 21-year-old who liked to play pranks and loved rock and roll. 20-year-old Patricia Matusek was a champion swimmer and was busy making wedding plans with her fiancé. Suzanne Ferris was 21 and planning a career in pediatric nursing. She too was looking forward to her upcoming wedding. Pamela Wilkening was known as Willie to her friends. She was 20 years old and once told a friend, "I want to be a nurse more than anything in the world." Valentina Passion was an exchange nurse from the Philippines. She was 24 years old and had been in the United States for only 10 weeks. Another exchange nurse, Merlita Gargulo, was 23 and the eldest of 9 brothers and sisters. She was homesick for her family in the Philippines. 22-year-old Gloria Davy enjoyed writing poetry and had recently celebrated her engagement. She was described as the class golden girl.
Myself and my partner Byron Carlisle were the first 2 detectives on the scene.
Homicide detective Jack Walenda.
On the couch was a nude woman with her hands tied behind her back. As I walked up the stairs, at the top of the stairway was a body of a naked girl. When I turned to the right, to the front bedroom, there was 3 more bodies laying in that room, and all 3 girls had stab wounds and puncture wounds in the various parts of their body. When walking out of that bedroom into the front west bedroom, there was a body on the bed, and she had her throat cut. And then on the floor in that same bedroom were the 2 Filipino girls, and the other girl had her throat slashed where you could take the side of your hand and place it in the wound.
I counted 8 bodies. He said, yeah, there's 8 victims. He said, but there's 1 survivor next door. I said, survivor? Survivor?
Corazon Amarao, also an exchange nurse from the Philippines, lives through the massacre. She is 23 and has been in Chicago less than 3 months. Amarao sends most of her earnings home to help put 2 younger sisters through college. Now, she is the sole survivor of these brutal murders.
Because of that, we have much more detailed information about what was happening over a course of 4.5 hours that comprised these vicious homicides than in almost any other case.
William Martin, a young assistant state's attorney, is put in charge of the prosecution. Martin, who later writes a best-selling book about the murders, relies heavily on Amarao's testimony to make his case. Amarao has never discussed the murders in the media until an appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show in 1993.
I was scared before because I thought he might come and get me. So now that he's dead, I can do it.
Corazon went to bed at 11 o'clock.
She is awakened by a knock at her bedroom door.
I got up from the bed and I opened the door without asking who he is because I thought it was one of the nurses from the other room that they just want me to wake them up in the morning or something.
And when she opened the door, she was confronted by a man all dressed in black, and he was pointing a gun at her. And at that point, her roommate woke up, and at gunpoint, he ushered the 2 of them out of their bedroom, down a small corridor, into a large bedroom.
Brandishing his gun, the intruder forces 4 other sleepy roommates into the large bedroom.
When we were there in that big bedroom, he just said, I just want some money. I'm going to New Orleans. But he still had that gun in his hand.
He marched all of the 6 nurses then in the townhouse into their respective bedrooms and got, I think, $23. It's all the money they had among all 6 of them.
He tells them, "I'm not going to hurt you." He smiles and smokes a cigarette.
Wasn't everybody really scared?
Well, I think they were scared, but it seems like the way he talked to us, it seems like he's not gonna do anything. It seems like he's not gonna hurt us.
The man takes the nurses back into the large bedroom. Then he takes a bed sheet and slices it into strips. It's the first time Amarao notices the knife.
And then he took the strips and, starting with the first young woman in line, Pamela Wilkening, tied her wrists behind her back and then tied her ankles very tightly together in front of her. And he would do this by keeping the gun right next to his hand as he tied them and had the knife also in his hand.
Every time someone moved, the gun will point on you. So I was just scared just seeing that gun pointing at me every time I moved.
Yeah.
So I think, that's why I was not able to do anything.
At no point did any of the 6 attempt to resist. Their instincts as nurses were go along with them. When you get a violent patient in the emergency room, you try to be calm and not provoke them. They didn't want to provoke him. They simply thought he just wanted their money and he wasn't going to hurt them. They just wanted to tie him up so that he could get away without their calling the police.
Sometime around midnight, someone opens a door downstairs.
And that someone was Gloria Jean Davy. Her fiancé had dropped her off in front, and they had sat in the car listening to a late-night radio show and the song, You'll Never Walk Alone. And they hummed the song together. Gloria Jean was a very beautiful young woman. Got out of the car, waved goodnight to her boyfriend, went in the townhouse, and went up the stairs.
The man crouches behind the bedroom door as Davy enters, then quickly binds her hands and feet.
Again, this routine of smoking a cigarette, talking. After a short period of time, he got up and walked over to the first woman in line, Pamela Wilkening, untied the bindings off of her ankles, lifted her up, keeping her hands tied behind her back, and took her out of the bedroom. What we know next is the two women who had been out shopping, Ferris and Jordan, came running into this back bedroom, and right behind them was Speck with the gun in his hand saying, "You two, come here. You two, come here." And he took them quickly out of the bedroom, shut the door.
I said, my God, I think he was raping them, or, you know. But I was not thinking that he was killing them.
They were killed on the spot very violently. Both of them were brutally stabbed. Ferris was strangled with a nurse's stocking as well. The struggle was heard, and then dead silence.
But the ordeal is far from over.
And then after a period of maybe a total of 30 or 40 minutes, Corazon reports the macabre sound of water running in the wash basin right outside the bedroom that she was captive in.
One by one, the other women are led from the room.
But I still did not thought that he was killing them.
He would untie, remove, door would be shut. There might be sounds of a brief struggle, then quiet for 20 to 30 minutes. Again, the running of the water in the washroom. Again, his return for the next victim. At one point, Corazon was able to wiggle under one of the bunk beds and hide there because the covers were hanging over.
Amaral hides under the bed for more than an hour as the slaughter continues. Finally, only Gloria Davy and Corazon Amaral are left alive. But the killing isn't over yet when Crime Stories continues. We now return to Richard Speck, born to raise hell on Crime Stories. In the early morning hours of July 14th, 1966, 7 student nurses lie dead in their townhouse in southeast Chicago. 2 remain alive. Corazon Amaral watches from her hiding place under the bed as the intruder takes Gloria Davy out of the room.
Was gone for another half hour, came back up, turned the light on, went through some more purses, threw the purses on the floor, almost hit her in the head with one purse.
While I was hiding under the bed, I thought he saw me, but he did not look like that under the bed.
His goal was to kill them all, and he killed them all, except Corazon, who slid under that bed as far as she could.
Incredibly, the killer leaves the townhouse, forgetting his final victim. After waiting 2 hours, she emerges from her hiding place.
I got up from under the bed. I was untied then. And then I went to the other room, and I saw all the bodies lying.
I said to myself, that girl's gonna be catatonic in minutes. You know, that was my impression. I just thought she's gonna flip out.
And I climbed out the ledge and asked for help. Yeah.
And do you remember what you said?
I said that everybody's dead.
Everybody's dead.
Yeah.
I'm the only one alive.
Yeah.
I never thought she'd ever testify in court or ever be able to identify the assailant.
But Corazon Amaral can identify the assailant, and she becomes the key to finding the killer. With her help, a police artist sketches a portrait of the suspect. Within hours, police issue a detailed description. A white male, about 25 years old, 6 feet tall, with short or crew-cut hair, and a tattoo on his arm reading, "Born to Raise Hell."
Jack Wanda concentrated on the physical evidence and viewing the bodies. And that's how the police investigation began.
As the investigation sweeps through the neighborhood, police make inquiries at the National Maritime Union Hiring Hall, just across the street from the murder scene. Union officials there have a photograph on file of a man named Richard Speck. It closely matches the sketch.
After he had left the crime scene, he walked back where he was staying. He went to a local tavern about 4 or 5 blocks from there, had a couple of drinks.
Sort of another typical day at the office for Dick Speck was to just go bar hopping starting at 11 in the morning. In the meantime, as he toured bars on the southeast side by listening to the radio, he found out he had left a survivor, which I'm sure was news to him. And he found out there was a manhunt, but certainly his name was not mentioned.
Feeling the heat, Speck disappears into Skid Row on Friday, July 16th, as police comb the city looking for him. However, like many American cities in the mid-60s, Chicago is in the midst of a race riot, and much of the force is busy controlling the violence on the streets of the city's west side. Still, police nearly catch Speck several times.
The morning after the murders, he was drinking, playing pool, and 3 plainclothes tack men came in, and they had very little to go on by way of a detailed description. They just basically asked, has there been anybody here who's acted strange or out of the ordinary? And the bartender said no. And Speck is 10 feet away shooting pool.
Later, Speck brings a prostitute back to his hotel.
This woman, upon leaving Speck's room at dawn, came down to the desk clerk and said, the man in room 806 has a gun.
Soon, the police arrive.
These were officers right at the end of a 12-hour shift because of the race riots. They had the anonymous tip that the man had a gun, a very routine kind of investigation. They had absolutely no reason to suspect it had anything to do with the murders.
The officers confiscate the gun, but they don't arrest the man.
And they leave. And in the famous last words department, one policeman says to the other, he's harmless.
Police bring Speck's photograph to Corazon Amaral, and she identifies him as the intruder. Meanwhile, the crime lab matches Speck's fingerprints to those found at the murder scene. Now there is no doubt Richard Speck is the killer. In a controversial move, Police Superintendent O.W. Wilson holds Speck's photo up at a press conference and names him as the murderer.
Superintendent, isn't it up to a court of law to determine if Speck is the killer?
Yes.
You've already identified him as the killer?
He is. He is.
Soon, Speck's picture is on the front page. With his capture imminent, he returns to his flophouse and slits his wrists with a broken wine bottle.
Richard Speck's alleged murder rampage stopped here on Chicago's Skid Row early today.
What exactly did you hear?
Smashing of bottles. That's all I heard, and he didn't utter one word.
You were the first one to discover Speck. What happened?
When he opened the door, well, he was a mess. He was blood from one end to the other.
Speck's cubicle was splattered with blood when viewed today.
The manager calls the police. A paddy wagon shows up with two 35-year veterans who have Speck's picture on their clipboard in the front of the paddy wagon and his descriptions. Been broadcast everywhere who the killer is.
No one at the Star Hotel seems to have connected him to the murders of the 8 girls or to his photograph that appeared in the papers yesterday.
They arrive there, go up, put a tourniquet on the wound, put him on a stretcher, take him to Cook County Hospital, bring him in the emergency room, drop him off, leave.
After severely hurting himself, Speck was taken to Cook County Hospital by police as a routine emergency case.
They're simply responding to one of the many routine calls of a man injured in a flop house, so they don't check him out, and the name's different, and they just leave him there.
No one yet knows who the man in the emergency room is, but Dr. Leroy Smith notices a strong resemblance to a picture he has just seen in the newspaper.
I was looking for this tattoo mark that had been written in the paper, "Born to Raise Hell." And I didn't see it, but I did, I saw some blood on his left arm, which I moistened with my hand, and I wiped the blood away, and I saw this V, this large V appear.
Slowly, more letters emerge from beneath the blood. B-O-R-N, Born to Raise Hell. It's the same tattoo Corazon Amaral says she saw on the arm of the intruder. But is the man in the emergency room really the killer? Next on Crime Stories. We now return to Richard Speck, Born to Raise Hell, on Crime Stories. July 17th, 1966. Chicago police continue to search for the man who murdered 8 student nurses just days before. Meanwhile, Richard Speck, who has been publicly accused of the crime by the Chicago police superintendent, lies in the emergency room at the Cook County Hospital. His arm bears a threatening tattoo, the same one seen by Corazon Amaral, Born to Raise Hell. Whether born to it or not, there is little doubt that Richard Speck is a long-time hellraiser.
And Speck had a checkered background, a very poor childhood, black sheep of his family. His natural father died when Richard was 9 years old. His mother remarried. Her second husband moved the family to Dallas. He used to beat Richard. He was a heavy drinker. Richard used to get into his liquor. Richard became a heavy drinker. And Speck had a fairly long criminal history, 41 arrests starting at age 13 for all kinds of minor things. He had done a 1 to 3 in Huntsville, Texas for forgery and burglary. He was no stranger at age 24 to police lockup.
In fact, Speck is still wanted in Texas for burglary.
Was a hardened criminal because he had fought before, and we believed that he had killed before.
Speck is also the leading suspect in the robbery and rape of an elderly woman and the murder of a barmaid in Monmouth, Illinois in the spring of 1966. He is questioned in connection with the murder, but flees before he can be charged. He ends up in Chicago at the house of his sister and brother-in-law. Speck stays at his sister's house for 3 weeks until on July 11th, just 2 days before the nurse massacre, his brother-in-law takes him to the Maritime Hiring Hall to look for work. It's the last time he sees Speck until his capture a week later.
The state's attorney's office is notified. Everybody in the command structure is notified. They all descend on Cook County Hospital, and at that point, technically, he is placed under arrest.
While Richard Speck remains silent about the night of the crimes, his fate is now in the hands of Chief Prosecutor William Martin. Martin fears that the massive pretrial publicity will jeopardize his case against Speck.
The only control we had was to shut down any leaks, shut down any direct comments.
The pressure on the prosecution is enormous.
The danger was in making a mistake. There were a lot of things that could have been done that could have lost it.
Despite his fears, Martin has a very strong case.
The crowning jewel of the physical evidence was 3 fingerprints with massive points of identity, 17, 17, and 12. Not only were they beautiful fingerprints, they were on the south bedroom door on the 2nd floor of the house, and Speck had absolutely no explanation whatsoever as to how his fingerprints could have gotten on that door except the night of the murder.
Martin also has his eyewitness.
The fingerprints were the crowning jewel, but the crowning human jewel was Corazon Amaral, who was simply the best witness I have ever seen before or since.
But before testifying, Amaral must first look into the face of evil. She is asked to identify in person the alleged killer of her friends. We now return to Born to Raise Hell on Crime Stories. Just 5 days after the brutal slaughter of 8 student nurses in July 1966, the sole survivor of the massacre, Corazon Amaral, is asked to identify the assailant. Disguised as a working nurse, she visits his hospital room and confirms that Speck is indeed the killer. With just $10 to his name, Speck is assigned public defenders to represent him. Gerald Getty leads the defense team.
I talked to him approximately 3 or 4 minutes. I advised him of his rights.
Marshal Hartman assists Getty.
Actually, there were 2 theories for the defense of this case. One was insanity as a defense, and the other was alibi, that he was somewhere else at the time and did not commit the offense at all.
Believing that the senseless murders can only be the work of a madman, defense attorneys asked Judge Herbert Passion to appoint a panel of experts to determine if Speck is even competent to stand trial.
The question was he psychotic sufficient to be classified as insane under Illinois law, or was he a sociopath, which would be a condition but would not qualify as insanity normally?
The experts decide that Speck is not legally insane.
Well, I don't think he really understood anything. He was uneducated. He was an itinerant sailor, and beyond that, I really can't tell you about the rest of his personality, except I did believe he was insane.
I have to tell you that Speck was a very, and this may surprise a lot of people, he was a very moral person, basically.
Dr. Marvin Ziporin is the chief psychiatrist at the Cook County Jail. After meeting with Speck more than 100 times, he concludes that the suspect was brain damaged as a child.
Human beings operate a lot like an automobile. An automobile has an accelerator, which gets the aggression going, and a braking system to control it. Now, if you can visualize that we all have this aggression, if the brakes become defective, then the car gets out of control. And especially if you have bad brakes that become, let's say, wet. And that's what happened with Speck. His brakes were wet as a result of taking in a lot of alcohol and speed and barbiturates the night of the crime. And he had defective brakes because he had brain damage.
Dr. Ziporin reports his findings to the defense team.
I told Getty that in my opinion, Speck, by reason of mental defect, was not responsible for his actions on the night of the crime. He was insane at the time of the crime, from a legal point of view.
Nonetheless, even Dr. Ziporin feels Speck should stand trial.
He was competent to stand trial. He once asked me if I would allow him to babysit with my children. And I said, certainly, as long as you're not drinking. And that was my assessment of the situation.
With the question of Speck's competency resolved, the defense now turns to the issue of pretrial publicity.
There was nothing on the newspapers or radio on TV that didn't lead with this case. I think we were pretty sure that he could not get a fair case in Cook County.
Defense attorney Jerome Wexler.
My initial role was to prepare and argue a motion for change of venue out of Cook County because it was obvious this was going to be a very, very hot case. At that time, no case had ever been moved out of Cook County for pretrial publicity. You always try your lawsuit with one eye on the appellate court to give the appellate lawyers a kind of record that will give them something to talk about.
Fearing he might win the case in Cook County, but later be overturned on appeal, Prosecutor Martin decides not to oppose a change of venue.
My view was, even though I don't think he's met the legal test, why the hell should we take a chance? Why don't we just give it to him? And, you know, that way we've taken the issue away from him. We don't have to worry about it.
Judge Passion agrees to move the trial south to Peoria, Illinois. Meanwhile, Martin is busy preparing his case. There are literally hundreds of pieces of physical evidence, enough to fill a 17-page catalog. Bed sheets, blouses, T-shirts, blood, hair, and semen.
All that evidence was circumstantial evidence of proximity to the scene and having a gun and a knife not far from the scene of the crime.
Most important of all, Martin has his eyewitness.
Corazon Amaral is a live eyewitness, absolutely amazing, not only on the issue of what happened, how it happened. She gave the most striking courtroom identification that would lie among the annals of American jurisprudence. When the crime first occurred, we were very concerned about her mental state after what she had been through.
Martin assigns round-the-clock police protection for Amarao, her mother, and her cousin, who fly in from the Philippines to be with her.
And we took her mother, and her cousin all the way from the far southeast side of Chicago to the very far north side to a resort, put her under an assumed name. We had 4 policemen to protect them, guard them, and befriend them.
And it was up to us to see if we couldn't gain her confidence.
Sergeant James Concannon is one of Amarao's protectors.
Get her mind off of this terrible thing that took place. I don't think there'd be many people that could come through all of this without almost losing your mind.
The theory was just to let her trust us.
Gerald Getty's top assistant, ex-FBI agent James Gramenos, interviews Amarao before the trial.
The woman had been coached at great length.
Because she was coached by the prosecution, Gramenos concludes that Amarao is not a credible witness.
It was a lengthy interview using the skills that I had developed over the years of interviewing subjects that ranged from homicide individuals, bank robbers. It was an interview where those of us that have read it, and the prosecution having read it, if it was just a common, non-notorious case on a bench trial, it would have been a finding of not guilty.
With the pre-trial skirmishing now over, the question of Richard Speck's guilt or innocence is left for a jury to decide. When Crime Stories returns. now return to Richard Speck, born to raise hell. On Monday, February 20th, 1967, Richard Speck, accused of brutally murdering 8 student nurses, arrives at the Peoria County Courthouse. Handcuffed to 2 armed guards, Speck is held under tight security. A horde of reporters convenes outside the courthouse, and spectators anxious for a seat at the trial undergo a lengthy security check. Selecting a jury is a long, laborious process.
It took 6 weeks because we did them one at a time, but I think it was a way to get as fair a jury as you could get.
The jury selection process was illegal and unfair.
If you had scruples against the death penalty, the prosecutor could ask you that question, and if you had scruples, you could be taken off the jury for cause.
It was a death-prone jury that was selected. It was for sure a guilt-prone jury, because once you eliminate people and have only people on the jury who firmly say that they have no religious scruple, they have no personal scruple against the infliction of the death penalty, it's the U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly stated that that method of jury selection results in a guilt-prone jury, and therefore it's violation of due process.
Despite defense objections to the jury selection process, the trial of the People versus Richard Speck begins on April 3rd. Speck pleads not guilty. From the beginning, he has asserted that he does not know anything about the crimes.
We bear not any hatred or revenge. There's nothing we can do to restore the 8 lives that were lost. Our only function is to enforce the law of this state.
The case was very structurally simple.
Martin carefully lays the groundwork. He can place Speck near the scene prior to the murders. He has Speck's fingerprints inside the townhouse, and he has Corazon Amaral to identify Speck as the murderer.
Very early in the direct examination, the question was, after she described opening the door, man pointing at her with a gun, all dressed in black, do you see in the courtroom today that man who came to your door on the night of July 13th?
The survivor was asked by Martin to step down from the witness stand to identify the man. So she comes down to this large console table where there's only Speck, Getty, and me.
Corazon quietly stood up, walked directly over to the fence table, and Speck was sitting between Getty and Ramenos, walked up to him, and within inches of his forehead, pointed and said in an unshakably clear voice, "This is the man."
And walks up to the table, points her finger at Speck and stated, "This is the man." But it's very dramatic.
Most observers agree that Amaral's testimony is devastating to the defense. Prosecutor Martin quits while he's ahead.
The defense side of the Richard Franklin Speck murder trial opened in Peoria with the testimony of his mother and brothers and sisters.
We spoke to Speck's sister. She was a very nice person. Of course, she was very upset with what her brother did, but she couldn't give us reason or why.
But showing the jury that Richard Speck's family loves him is no match for Corazon Amaral's dramatic identification.
In any case that you're trying, when you have that kind of a dramatic ending or crescendo, very effective. What did we have?
Amazingly, what the defense has is its own eyewitnesses, ready to testify that at the precise time of the murders, Speck was drinking in Kay's Lounge, the bar where they worked.
2 people came to the state's attorney's office and notified them that Richard Speck was not guilty, that he was with them the night of the crime. They were not his friends. They didn't know him from before.
They didn't know him, they didn't know his name, but they'd seen his picture and they thought he was in the bar twice that night, the last time at 12:30, and of course, we know the killer entered at 11, and if they were right, then Speck was innocent.
There were 2 eyewitnesses who told Getty and I, when we interviewed them at Kay's Lounge, that on the night of the reported killing in July, that they saw Richard Speck. They recognized his picture that had been published in the newspaper with frequency.
And we interviewed them several times, and the more we interviewed them, the more adamant they became that Speck was their patron and they were offering him an alibi.
The husband and wife team said, we have told the police, we told the prosecutor who interviewed us, that it couldn't have been him because at 11 o'clock he was here. He had been here for over a half hour. And the location of the bar was approximately 1 mile east of the townhouse where the slaughter occurred.
They could be in good faith mistaken, as opposed to Cora, who was so certain, who had so much better opportunity. But, you know, if you want to call it a tie, then I think the fingerprints win.
Without Corazon Amarao's eyewitness testimony, I believe that the jury might have found that he was somewhere else at the time of the crime. Say checked. Then there were other witnesses that saw him. There's no question he was in that bar that night. The only question was, what time did he leave? Did he leave at 10 o'clock, which would have given him time to commit the murders, or did he leave at midnight, which would have meant somebody else did it?
Who will the jury believe, Corazon Amarao or the workers in Kay's lounge? After deliberating for just 49 minutes, the jurors return with their answer.
Exactly 9 months and 2 days ago, 8 student nurses were stabbed, beaten, and strangled to death in a Chicago townhouse. Today, here in Peoria, 25-year-old Richard Speck was convicted of murdering the 8 girls. And the jury chose to sentence Speck to death.
All I can say is we tried this case to the best of our ability. We feel that we tried it in the best traditions of the legal profession.
We presented the evidence to the citizens of this county. We believe that they did their duty in returning their verdict.
The jury recommends the death penalty, and the public also cries out for vengeance. But Richard Speck's attorneys still search for a way to save their client's life. When Crime Stories returns. We now return to Richard Speck, born to raise hell on Crime Stories. Richard Speck is convicted of butchering 8 student nurses in July of 1966. Although his trial is over, his legal battle is not. In fact, his struggle to stay alive is just beginning.
Our only alternative now is a motion for a new trial.
Judge Passion denies the motion for a new trial.
There's an automatic stay of execution till final order of the Supreme Court because the appeals in a death case are automatic.
Mr. Getty, would you appeal them?
That's up to the court to appoint us for appeal.
Richard Speck has spent 4 years on death row in Illinois' Stateville prison when, on June 28, 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that potential jurors opposed to capital punishment had been improperly excluded from his trial. 1 year later, the High Court rules that the death penalty itself is unconstitutional. So, on September 20th, 1972, the Illinois Supreme Court voids Speck's death sentence. On November 21st, he is back in the Peoria courtroom. He is resentenced to 400 to 1,200 years in prison.
As defense lawyers, if you lose a case of the death penalty, you've done nothing. If you succeed in a case of that magnitude to keep the man from going to the death chair, that is a major victory. Society get what they deserved. If it was a fair trial, and if fairness prevailed in the jury selection process, Richard Speck would have been executed.
Speck maintains his innocence until 1978, when he tells a reporter from the Chicago Sun-Times, "Yeah, I killed him. I stabbed and choked them."
I had to go to Joliet prison where Speck was being held, and a friend of mine who was an assistant warden took me into the cell house, and he told me that Speck was up in the second tier. And I walked up the stairs and around to his cell, and he was sitting on his bunk, cross-legged Indian style, and drawing pictures. And on the wall of his cell, he had pasted all the pictures of the girls that he had killed, and he would be able to sit on his bunk and look at the girls. He saw me standing at the bars, and he recognized me, and his drawl, southern drawl, "Hello, Mr. Detective." And he walked over, and he showed no remorse whatsoever.
Speck's prison sentence ends on December 5th, 1991, when, 1 day shy of his 50th birthday, he dies from a massive heart attack. He has spent more than half his life behind bars.
You just had a mean man with a malignant heart. It was a senseless thing.
Well, to me, Speck was not the monster he was depicted to be. He was frightened, lonely, insecure, and desperately in need of approval. There's a lot of Richard Speck in all of us. You, me. We just have the ability to control it.
One of the difficult questions that was raised when we were working on the case was questions like, how can you work on such a case? A man kills 8 women, slaughters them, and you work on that case? And as lawyers, if we're assigned to a case, then we do the best for that case, for that person, no matter what.
Many years have gone by, but for years I used to have really nightmares about the photos, and I had wished that I had not seen those photos. I can't believe it. Those girls suffered. Those girls were not related to me. If they were, I could understand the anger the parents had. The parents of the survivors, as well as the parents of the decedents. They were in court. I was there every day. They were looking at us. I felt bad. Despite of how bad I felt, I was a lawyer, and I wasn't about to violate my duties as a lawyer, and I did the best I could to defend a client.
I think what the Speck case did was change a national perception of innocence and resulted in a real loss of innocence. It was unprecedented in the extent of its rage and violence without provocation.
8 girls minding their own business, getting ready for Betty Bye. And this goof comes in there and slaughters them. That's what was unusual about it. It was a slaughter. He had no mercy on none of them girls.
Richard Franklin Speck was a very ordinary guy, and that's, in the final analysis, what makes him so frightening. We've all met lots of Richard Specks in our life. They knock on the door and ask if they could shovel the snow. We see them panhandling on the street. A very ordinary guy. We've all met lots of Richard Specks.
If not for Corazon Amarau's testimony, Richard Speck might never have been convicted of the brutal murders of the 8 student nurses. And to this day, there is no real explanation for why these women were killed. But Speck's killing spree changed the way Americans felt about their safety. The privacy and security of the home could no longer be taken for granted. For Crime Stories, I'm Richard Belzer.